Welcome to this Blender for Absolute Beginners tutorial series. There are many great 3D artists producing content out there, and there are countless of great Blender tutorials, many of which I have followed myself. What I aim to do with this series, however, is to make a complete beginner series that'll teach you the basics by introducing functionality as we use it. If you're anything like me, you want to get to the creative part as soon as possible, so there will not be a long introduction on the interface or all the functions. Instead, we will dive right in and begin modeling, and everything we use will be explained as we use it. The main goal of this tutorial is, of course, to model this TeaSet. In each lesson, we will make one part beginning with the saucer and ending with the teapot. Steps learned in this first lesson will be repeated and built upon in the next lesson, so as to not only let you learn, but also practice as you follow along. And to finish it all off with a render that you can be proud of. When looking around for suitable reference material, I came across this Art Deco TeaSet from Royal Doulton. I wasn't able to find any specific information about exactly what date this design is from, but it seems to be from somewhere around 1930 to 1940. The design is clean and simple, which makes replicating it easier, yet it looks fancy. If you haven't already installed Blender, now would be a good time to do so. This tutorial is made with Blender 2.82a, but will also work with Blender 2.8 and 2.81 as well. You can get the latest version of Blender at www.blender.org. There will be a link in the description. So let's get going. In this first video, we will begin by modeling the saucer. There are, however, a few pitfalls that might be good to know about before we begin. For example, the letter W on the keyboard changes the selection cursor. You can always toggle it back by pressing W a couple of times. So if you ever find yourself with your mouse cursor looking like this, with a circle around it, that means that you probably accidentally pressed W, and you can change it back either by toggling W, as I said, or going up here in the top left-hand corner of the display, make a long press and choose Select Box instead. Secondly, this little thing here, this little cross with a circle of red and white in it, and that's called the cursor. If you've accidentally pressed this button over here, that means that you move around the cursor and place it in different places. We won't be using the cursor throughout this tutorial series. So if you've accidentally done that and want to restore it, you press Shift S, cursor to world origin, and go back here and choose Select Box instead. And lastly, if you want to move around windows, you can grab the edge of a window and split it. And if you want to put it back, you grab the edge again and pull it over. And now it's restored. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's begin by removing everything in the scene. This might seem a bit drastic, but don't worry, everything we need, we will add it as we need it. So with the select tool, drag across the screen, release, and press delete to delete everything. Now, we need to choose a mesh object shape to begin modeling our saucer from. Let's choose a cylinder. We can do that either by going to the add menu up here, choose mesh and cylinder, or Shift A on the keyboard to get the same menu but by your mouse. And let's choose a cylinder. As you can see, we also now got a little menu down here. If it didn't open up like this for you, it should look like this instead. If you accidentally press anywhere outside of the cylinder or enter or anything like that, that one disappears. But to get it back, we just delete the cylinder and create a new cylinder. Here we go. These are just some basic settings for the cylinder, and all of these settings except for the number of vertices can be chosen from this menu up here. If we press the little arrow and choose item, you can also access this menu by pressing N on the keyboard. Alright, so most of these settings we want to leave as is. We do want to change the depth, which is the height of the cylinder in this case, to 0.1. As you can see, we're working in meters right now, and yes, a radius of 1 meter is pretty big, but let's not focus on being true to life in scale. Let's focus on the creative part instead. All right, so let's get a closer look on our now disk. We do that by scrolling on the scroll wheel on the mouse. And if you feel like you want to move around a bit, you can press down the middle mouse button and rotate by moving the mouse. And all right, let's start editing this. So we need to go into edit mode. We can do that either by pressing this menu up here, edit mode, or by tabbing into it by using tab. As you can see, while in edit mode, the cylinder looks a bit different. We got all these little dots going around here. These are the individual vertices. But we don't need to go about moving around individual vertices. Not now, at least. So let's go over to face select, which is the third one in this menu here. The middle one is edges and the leftmost one is vertices. But let's stay on faces. Let's click on the top face. And now we want to extrude this one. So we press E for extrude. And let's move it upwards just a tiny little smidgen. And let's scale it up by pressing S. And let's scale it quite a bit. That looks pretty good. And let's do it again, extrude. As you can see, when we choose extrude, we get this blue line going across. That is the direction of which you're extruding. Normally, if you haven't rotated your object or anything, it will extrude in the closest direction, like the z-axis or the y-axis or the x-axis. You can always choose exactly which axis you want to use as well by just pressing either Z, X, or Y on the keyboard. But in this case, I don't want to move it any further. I just want to scale it. So I press S instead, and let's scale this up a bit. That seems good enough for me. And now let's move it upwards just a tiny bit. So let's press G on the keyboard and then choose the axis Z, which is upwards, and move it up a tiny bit. Here we go. And let's do that one more time. So E for extrude, S to scale, and G and Z to grab it and move it upwards a bit. And I wanted this last one to be a bit more of a curve. And this looks pretty good. So now let's create that little edge that they usually have on saucers. So let's press E again and S, but this one let's move the mouse inwards to scale it in. And E again and scale, because now we want to make the curvature on the inside. And let's press G and Z to move it downwards a little bit. And we can see that, yeah, the circle that we created is smaller than the one on the underside. So let's drop it here by clicking and scale it upwards a little bit so that we're basically right on top of the edges that we have on the underside, and that looks pretty good. Here we go. And E to extrude and S to scale again, move it inwards a bit more, and that should be quite good. Let's move it down with Z, and that is perfectly fine. ES again and move it inwards. GZ to move it downwards, and we can see that we should scale this down a bit more, so let's scale it. And ES to scale it in a little bit more after extrusion, and GZ to create a little dimple here in the middle. And this looks pretty good, I would say. Yes. I do, however, want to move this edge inwards a bit more, so I'm going to choose edge selection here and press this edge. And I want to select the entire edge loop here, so I press Alt Shift and click. And let's scale it inwards just a tiny bit and move it downwards just a tiny smidgen. And now we can see that what I did is I moved this edge past the height of the lower edge. And to rectify this, we need to choose this edge here and press beside it to choose the entire edge loop and move this down a tiny little bit too. Ooh, that's a bit too much. You can always press left shift when moving something to move it in smaller increments. And let's choose this one again and move it slightly downwards. Here we go. That's looking pretty good. It's going to be a very flat saucer. So let's focus on this edge over here. We want to have a new little edge going close to this edge so that we can have it more accentuated. So let's press Ctrl R on the keyboard to create an edge loop. Press with the left mouse button and move it up close to this one here. Pretty close. And let's move this upwards a little bit. So press G, Z and move it upwards. And you can see what we did now is that we moved this past this one in height. So let's choose this one. Shift Alt, click on the next one to choose the entire edge loop. G to grab, Z to move upwards, and let's move it up a little bit so it goes above, so we get a nice little curvature there. And let's actually create yet another edge loop on the inside here by Ctrl R, click, move it all the way up, and G to and Z, and move it slightly downwards, so we get a nice little lip there. This also means that we need to do something on the other side, otherwise this looks pretty darn flat. So Ctrl R, click, move towards the edge, pretty close, G, Z, and move slightly downwards, not too much, just a little bit, so we get an edge, and that is looking pretty good. Great. So on a saucer, the underside is usually a bit bigger than the hole here, so let's go ahead and make this one a bit bigger as well. So let's Alt Shift and click to select the upper edge loop. Alt Shift click to select the lower one as well. And let's scale this up with just S. That's a tiny smidgens. Here we go. That looks pretty good. Zoom out a bit. Yes. And click on this edge here to deselect it all and just select the inner one and scale it in a little bit and press E, S to extrude and scale a little bit more, and one more time ES and scale in, and then grab it with G and move it tiny bit upwards with Z, so we get this nice little dimple on the other side as well. There we go. This is starting to look pretty nice. So but it's still very edgy, if one might say so. So let's go in here under modifiers. It's this little wrench over here. Let's add a modifier. Let's add a subdivision surface. What that does is basically that it creates more edges and vertices and faces all over. And if we tab out of edit mode, we should be able to see that this looks a great bit more smooth than it did before. As you can see, if I turn this on and off here, you can see that it creates a whole bunch of more edges. And that looks good. Let's tab back into edit mode. And let's try and make some of these edges a bit more accentuated. Or sharper, that is. So I'm gonna turn off the modifier by clicking on this one here. That makes the subdivision modifier not visible in the viewport. Because what we want to do is we want to have a new one here. Yeah, just around here. So let's press face select, press this one here, and let's press E to extrude and S to scale inwards. Here we go. And G, Z to move it slightly down as well. Slightly down. And now we can turn it up again. And we can see that it looks still not good, but better. Let's press Ctrl R here to create an edge loop inside here, and then we can move this edge loop about to make it even more sharp at the edges. And let's do the same thing here and move it up there. So if we tab out, we can see that, yep, it's looking sharper, which is what we want. And we also want to accentuate these edges here. I want to make sure that you can see that there's an edge there. So let's Control R here, click and move it upwards towards this one here. And on the inside between these two, let's do the same thing. Control R, click, and click. We don't need to move it. And then press G for grab and Z and move it slightly downwards, just a smidgen. And let's do the same thing with this edge that's over here. Control R, move upwards, almost all the way up. And let's create a new one in between there. Click and click again, and G and Z, and hold shift and just tiny little bit downwards. That's the smidgen. We get an edge there. So now we can see when we look at it, it's hard to tell now, but we can see that it goes a little bit down and a little bit down. Here we go. This is starting to look like an actual saucer. Now we want to do basically the same thing here. We want to make these edges sharper. So let's take our mouse and hold it in between here somewhere. Control R to make a new one, and let's move it in a little bit. And the same thing here probably. Let's see. Yes, we want to have it slightly up there. And tab out. And yes, that looks a lot better. That looks a lot better. Tab in again, and I actually want to move this one up a little bit, I think. No, what I want to do is I want to have another one here, I think. So let's move it here. Yep, slightly upwards there, just to make that edge a bit more accentuated. And let's move it down with Z. Grab a Z just to make it. Here we go, that looks good. All right, but it still doesn't look perfect, does it? We want to change our smoothing settings here because we want to make this really smooth. So let's go in on object here, and we have shade smooth. Click that one. Here we go. Now it's even smoother. We're actually getting pretty close to being done with this saucer, but we have a few more steps. Because this is just gray and very matte, and if we try to render it, it won't look good at all. So let's put some color to it. So let's move down here to this little ball here, which is the material properties. Let's create a new material. Let's call this porcelain, for example. Here we go. And we want the base color to be white, but we want it to be smoother, more shiny. So let's pull down the roughness here to, yeah, like 0.1 to begin with. Might work. And let's click on this one here, which is the shading options. We can choose between wireframe, we can choose between solid, and we can choose between shading and rendered. As of now, let's just go to viewport shading. We can see, yeah, this is very shiny. Very, very shiny. That is good. That is what we want. And now let's create yet another material because we want to have a golden rim. So press plus and new, and let's call this one gold, just so we can know by the name which one is which. Let's give it an orange color, kind of a deep orange color. And let's move the metallic up, because this is going to be golden, and gold is a metal, so let's move it up to 1, all the way. And let's make it really smooth, so 0.1 here as well. Should be good. But now we need to tell Blender what part should be golden. And we could use textures and stuff like that, but Blender is pretty smart. We can actually go in and say which specific faces are supposed to use which color. So let's press face here. Let's press on one of these faces, and we want to choose all the faces around there, and there is actually a pretty neat little trick we can do. After choosing this one, we can control and shift and press a bit further up, and it'll choose everyone in between. So we can go all the way around and choose just the faces that we want, and it'll choose everyone in between. So let's go all the way around. Here we go. Ooh, I misclicked, but that doesn't matter because I wanted to choose those afterwards either way. So let's just continue choosing these faces, and that face there. And let's see here. I would also like to choose this face here and this face over here because I want the edge to go around and over. And let's see here. That should be about correct. Here we go. And we're getting there. Ooh, Control Z because I accidentally pressed the wrong one. And here we go. Now we should have chosen all the way around. Yeah. So let's tell Blender that these should have a different material. So let's press gold here and press assign. And we have now assigned all of these faces the color gold. Looking neater already, right? Yes. And let's not forget, we need to save our project. So go up to File, Save. And if you haven't already saved it, you will get a prompt where it asks you to name your project and name it something that you can remember. This is the end of the first tutorial in the series. In the next video, we will model the cup, and in doing so, we will repeat a lot of the steps and concepts that you have learned in this video, as well as introduce a few new ones. We will also have a small introduction in some very simple texturing to add that little extra to your model. See you in the next one.